In the last section, we started the refactoring process to turn our stateless app widget into a stateful widget instead. As a quick reminder, we're going through this entire process right now because our app widget is going to have a counter variable associated with it. That counter variable is going to change over time, and anytime it changes, we want to update the representation of that widget on the screen of our device. So because we have data that's going to change over time, and updating that data should be reflected on the screen of our device, we have to use a stateful widget. And we just accomplished step number 1 of that refactor. We're now going to move on to step number 2, where we're going to add a createState method to the widget class. Whenever we call createState, it's going to return an instance of the widgetState class. So here's the widget class. This is the widgetState class. On the widget class, I'm going to add a method called createState. And from this thing, anytime someone calls this, I will return an instance of our widget state, or we are referring to it as the appState class. All right, so that's it for step number 2. Now, again, I know these steps are pretty confusing and they probably seem a little bit arbitrary. Once we get through all these steps, we will have a discussion on why we have to do all these crazy things in here. Let's just keep going for right now and get our code on the screen. So the next thing we have to do is add a build method to the widgetState class. So this is the widgetState class right here. And as you can see, we already have our build method on here. Our build method is returning all the widgets that our widget is going to show on the screen. So no work required for step number 3 right here. I just included it on this list to be complete. On to step number 4. So now we're going to add some instance variables to the widgetState class. And these instance variables are going to represent the data that we're going to have that's going to change over time. So on my widgetState class right here, I'm going to add on an instance variable that I'll call counter. I'll make it an integer, and it's going to start off as the number 0. So this is the instance variable that's going to change over time. Every time a user presses that blue button on the bottom right-hand side, we're going to attempt to increment the value of this counter variable by 1. And every time a user presses the button, we're also going to try to reflect the new counter value on the screen of our device. All right, so that's step number 4. And finally, on to step number 5. So step number 5 right here is going to kind of have 2 steps associated with it on its own. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we are changing that widgetState's data. So that would be the instance variable that we just created. So let's take care of that first. Let's think about where we need to increment that counter variable. Well, we want to make sure anytime someone presses the floating action button right here, we increment the counter variable. If you recall, when we created the floating action button, we created this onPressed property and assigned a function to it. We then saw that anytime user pressed this button, this function would be invoked. And so it seems to me like this would be the perfect place to take that counter variable and increment it by 1. So inside of the onPressed function, I'll add on counter plus equals 1, like so. So now every time we press the button, boom, counter incremented. So we now have some data that is changing over the life cycle of our application. Now on to step number 2 of this step number 5, I guess, part 2 of step number 5. So now we've changed our class data, we now need to call the setState method. So the setState method is provided to our appState class when we extend the state base class. So there is a method inside of the state thing right here called setState. And you and I are required to call it anytime our data changes and we want to get this component to update on the screen of our device. So right underneath the counter increment, I'm going to call setState, like so. Now you'll notice that I get the red squiggly right here. When we call setState, we are actually required to pass in a function. That's what this means right here. So we have to pass a function into setState. And inside of that function is where you and I are supposed to do our data modification. So right now, we just put down some code to increment counter outside of setState. This is not 100% correct. We're supposed to modify our instance variable inside of the function that we pass to setState. So let's do that refactor right now. I'm going to add in a function right here. Come on, there we go. Oh, no, one more, there we go. And I'm going to make sure that I mutate or change my instance variable inside of setState, like so. Okay, so that's it. That is the entire refactor. We now have a stateful widget called app that depends upon the widget state of app state. Anytime a user presses on our floating action button right here, we're going to increment the value of the counter variable. Now that's it for the refactor in terms of turning a stateless widget into a stateful widget. But to actually get our application working the way we expect, there's one last little thing we have to do. We have to make sure that the counter actually gets displayed somewhere within our widget. So right now we're incrementing the value of counter, but we never actually show it on the screen of our device. So to get it to show up on the screen, we're going to add one additional property to our scaffold widget right here. And we're going to make sure that that additional property gets our counter to show up on the device. Let's take a quick glance at the scaffold documentation, just so you get a good idea of where this is going to come from. So back at my widget documentation, let me get this up here. I'm going to do a search on the top right-hand side for scaffold again. And then down for the constructor of scaffold, you'll notice that there's the body property right here. So if we pass a widget to the body property of scaffold, the scaffold will show that on the body of the screen. So basically that counter variable will show up right here, which is exactly what we want. So back over inside of my scaffold widget, I'll add on the body property, and I'll have this be some text that's going to interpolate the counter variable in, like so. The text widget right here always expects to be called with a string, so that's why we are taking the counter variable and shoving it into the string. Counter itself is an integer, and the text widget does not want to see an integer. It wants to see a string. So we're just doing a quick kind of conversion right here of that integer into a string. So I'll now save this. We'll flip back over to our terminal. I'll do a full reload with Shift-R, and then we'll test this out on our device. All right, so it's going to take, I don't know, it always takes me like, there we go, 10 seconds. That's pretty quick. All right, so it's really, really small, but you might be able to see there is, in fact, a 0 right there. So now I'm going to press my button, and when I do so, you'll notice that that counter is incrementing successfully. So it's going up to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You get the idea. Okay, so it looks like we definitely have the ability to create some data that's going to change over time inside of our application. But it absolutely involved a lot of very strange code. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to talk about one little bit of weird syntax, specifically this state less than greater than app thing right here. And then we'll do a quick overview on why we had to write all this complicated code to make a stateful widget. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.